Next, we talk with Paul Schmipf, the Republican candidate for Attorney General, and hear his policy positions. Paul Schmipf, Republican candidate for Attorney General, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks a lot for having me again, Terry. It's been a long time since I've been on, kind of a good bookends to the campaign. You had me on last summer of 2013, when this process was just starting, and now we're getting close to the end of it, so I do appreciate you giving me the chance to come back on.
You know, it's difficult when one runs for office the first time and people don't know who you are. So let's remind people a little bit about your background and what you bring to the table as a candidate. And to me, one of the interesting aspects of your history is that you were involved in the prosecution of Saddam Hussein.
That's correct. Prior to being a candidate, I was on active duty in the United States Marine Corps. I got out as a lieutenant colonel in the summer of 2013 and pretty much rolled right into the campaign. And a lot of times people find out that I'm running for Illinois Attorney General and they're surprised. They say, well, you were in the Marine Corps. I didn't even know we had attorneys in the Marine Corps, but we do, and I've gotten to do some pretty amazing things. And one of the things that you mentioned was working the Saddam Hussein trial in Baghdad. I was actually the lead American attorney advisor to the Iraqi prosecutors in that case, and it was a fantastic experience being able to see history made just really right in front of your eyes.
We're not going to spend all the time on that, although I'm sure there's probably a lot of interesting stories. But before we move on to your issues for the campaign, were you in the room with him? Did you happen to interrogate Saddam, or what interaction, if any, did you have?
I was in the room with him a couple times, but during the trial itself, it was an Iraqi trial. Iraqi judges, Iraqi attorneys. I would watch the trial from either the visitors gallery or a closed circuit office. A lot of times, whenever the trial would recess, I would come down and meet with the Iraqi prosecutors. I'd talk to them about what evidence needed to be brought into the case. I really did a lot of coaching and mentoring, and really probably my biggest contribution to that trial was I actually was able to convince the Iraqi prosecutors that they needed to rehearse their evidentiary presentation. They wanted to just wing it. And it took me about 2 weeks to convince them that, you know what, guys, this would be a lot more effective if you actually rehearsed it beforehand. They finally agreed to that. They rehearsed it for about a week. And when they got the opportunity to present the evidence in that case, and most of the evidence was documentary, but when they presented it, Saddam actually snapped. He kind of had a moment like Colonel Jessup out of the movie A Few Good Men, where he stood up and said, so what? Everything they're saying is true. I did it. There was an assassination attempt against me, and I had to respond. And the so what part is, well, there were only 12 people involved in the assassination attempt, all killed in the gunfight. Saddam knew that, but he still ordered the execution of 148 men and boys that had nothing to do with the assassination attempt. And when he admitted that, it didn't matter how much of a circus or a kangaroo court the proceedings were, international due process standards had been satisfied.
Let's move on to how many years were you in the Marine Corps?
I was actually in the Marine Corps for 20 years. I was on active duty in the military for a total of 24 years. I was 4 years active duty in the United States Navy while I was attending the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. So I graduated from Annapolis in 1993. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. I was an infantry officer for 4 years. And then I switched over to become a lawyer in the Marine Corps, and I actually went to law school down at SIU Carbondale, which was nice because it was close to home.
You're running against Lisa Madigan, which people who pay any attention would know, and would say she's a formidable candidate. What motivated you to try to take on this challenge and run for Attorney General, and why should the people elect you instead of re-electing Lisa Madigan?
Well, it's important to realize that when I hung up my uniform for the last time after the 24 years that I was on active duty, that really didn't change who I am. I've been brainwashed by the Marine Corps. I believe you have a duty to serve, whether it's your country, your state, or your community. And even though my service in the Marine Corps is finished, I still want to serve the state of Illinois. I believe that the number one threat our state is facing is government corruption. I think that government corruption is what is keeping Illinois back, what's causing us to fall behind the other Midwestern states. If we are ever going to address corruption in this state, it needs to be by the Attorney General's office. And if we want the Attorney General to address corruption, it can't be somebody who is a political insider. It can't be somebody who is a career politician. I met Lisa Madigan for the first time a couple days ago. She is a good person and a nice lady, and we all need to respect the service that she's given to our state. But she's also been Attorney General for 12 years, over a decade. And during that time, all of us, Republican, Democrat, Independent, everybody will realize that Illinois has gotten more corrupt and more dysfunctional. So my message to the voters of Illinois is, if you're satisfied with the status quo and you want more of the same, go ahead and re-elect Lisa Madigan. But if you want somebody who's actually going to transform the Attorney General's office so that it can actually fight corruption, I ask the voters of Illinois to give me the opportunity to do that.
Aside from that, which is an understandable issue, I think, to raise, I know you put out about 14 points. You were saying of your campaign of 14 points to why to trust a Marine. What are, not that we can probably digest all 14, but what are some of the key points aside from that you're not a political insider that people should be electing you?
Well, the program we put out, it was called 14 Reasons to Trust a Retired Marine in 2014. And the idea was that we were going to give people 14 contrasts between my background and Attorney General Madigan's background, just so that people would have a bright line choice, knowing the difference between two candidates. A lot of times we complain that we say, well, the elections don't matter, the candidates are really the same. That's not the case in this election. There are very distinct differences both in our backgrounds and also our visions for the office. So, the most important reasons that we're getting down to here at the end, and we started at reason 14 and we've been counting them down David Letterman style, but the ones that we're getting to here at the end concern my qualifications and my abilities to work with people across the political and social spectrum. I was not recruited by the Republican Party. I'm not a career politician. I was in the military, as we discussed. And military service really gives you two things, I think. First of all, if you've been successful in the military, you're not afraid of any challenge. You have to change jobs quite a bit. You get a lot of responsibilities that you may not think you're ready for. And very quickly, you learn to have confidence in your own abilities. So people that have been successful in the military are not afraid to be thrown in the proverbial deep end of the pool. So that's one thing that military service gives. But the other thing, and one of the points that I specifically focused on as one of the 14 reasons, is if you're going to be successful in the military, you have to be able to work with people from across the political and social spectrum. There's no place for partisan ideologues in the military. In my service, I actually had an opportunity to work from the opposite ends of the spectrum back to back. I had the opportunity to work on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. I did a congressional fellowship for the United States Marine Corps, and I actually worked for a Republican congressman from Minnesota, John Klein. He's the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, very powerful Republican congressman. I was his military legislative assistant. That was calendar year 2008. As soon as that tour of duty finished, the Marine Corps sent me to the Pentagon, and I was working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working on energy and environment issues, and I actually was working for a political appointee in the Obama administration. So the Obama administration actually sent me abroad to represent the United States in international negotiations on energy and the environment. So I went from working for a Republican congressman to working for the Obama administration. I did a good job in both positions. And that's something that I think we need out of the Attorney General's office, because if you think about what our ideal Attorney General candidate would be, our ideal Attorney General, it would be somebody that's not overtly political, somebody that's not a fierce partisan, because you have to, the rule of law, if the rule of law is going to be effective, it can't be partisan.
Right now there's an effort to rewrite some of the criminal laws in the state of Illinois. A part of that would be, and Mayor Rahm Emanuel just came out the other day with Gary McCarthy of the police department in the city of Chicago about decriminalizing marijuana, that it's clogging our court systems, causing a lot of congestion in the courts, and we're not focusing, therefore, in the manpower on maybe the violent criminals because we're spending so much time on pot smokers. What are your thoughts on that, or just in general, as far as looking at the laws on the books and reevaluating here in 2014 the laws that people are still being prosecuted on that might have been passed back in the 30s, 40s, or 50s?
Well, one of my views of the role of the Attorney General's office is to make sure that we are reviewing and assessing the constitutionality of all the statutes in Illinois. Regarding the specific marijuana question that you have, it's important to note that there is a difference between legalization and decriminalization. Decriminalization, as I understand it, is you're not going to ruin people's lives over a minor pot smoking offense. You're going to have appropriate minor penalties, but it's not going to be legalized, and I certainly support that. That makes sense to me because our legal system is under this huge burden. So I support diversionary programs. I do support special drug courts. I do support decriminalization, but that's different from legalization of marijuana, which I don't support.
On the other hand, right now we also have, as an aside, a growing heroin epidemic, and there are just reports about how many people, frankly, of all age groups, dying of cheap heroin coming into the United States. So we also have to deal with that in law enforcement. Would you see yourself as being an advocate? Have you looked at the extent to which the law enforcement has the resources to do the job, or do you not see that as part of the Attorney General's role?
No, I do see that as something the Attorney General needs to help out with. I've had the opportunity on the campaign to do some heroin awareness events, and you're right, it is a tragedy how many young lives are being lost with the heroin epidemic. And the thing that's sad is it kind of really snuck up on us. Nobody really saw it coming. We were focused on other drugs. So I do think the Attorney General needs to help out law enforcement agencies with dealing with heroin. Where I differ from the current Attorney General is I believe that our number one threat in Illinois is government corruption, and I've gone on the record saying that fighting government corruption is going to be my number one priority if I'm elected Illinois Attorney General.
I will say, as an aside, I was just looking on the website the other day of the U.S. Attorney's Office for Northern District of Illinois, and there is just a laundry list of officials who are being investigated for political and official corruption at all levels, mayors, aldermen, and others. It was rather shocking. And in fact, as we tape this, we just had some lawmakers raising questions about how some of the monies are being spent or misspent. I don't want to cast allegations when there's it's still an investigation, but certainly Illinois has a long history of corruption.
Well, corruption is just systemic, and it's everywhere in Illinois. And I think fighting corruption really needs to be a team effort. It needs to be the local state's attorneys, it needs to be the feds, but it also needs to be the Illinois Attorney General's office. Right now, there's nobody that's really talking about fighting corruption in Illinois in terms of saying that's going to be my number one job. I don't think anybody is taking the lead. I think the Attorney General's office needs to do that. We've been relying on the feds to do a lot of our anti-corruption work, and I don't think that's working out well for us. I think our state is becoming more corrupt and more dysfunctional. There was a study that was just published this last May that actually identified a cost to each person from public corruption. They said that government corruption costs each person in Illinois $1,308 per person per year. If you multiply that number by the amount of people in Illinois, the result is staggering. It's $16.8 billion. That's billion with a B. And that's the extent of corruption in Illinois. That's about 1/3 of our budget shortfall. So I believe that government corruption is our number one threat, and that's why I want to make it my number one focus. But it can't just be me. I'm going to be working with the local state's attorney. I'm going to be working with the Department of Justice. It does need to be a team effort.
Do you think that you have flexibility in the application of the law, and that there is the element of common sense, and you need to know when not to prosecute as well as when to prosecute? Or are you one of the people, and I'm not saying either is right or wrong, that would say, if you violate the law, that's the law, and it's not up to me to decide whether or not you should be prosecuted?
Well, I think you're identifying two distinct topics. You're talking about both, where does the Attorney General's loyalty lay? Is it to the Constitution, or is it to their own political views? And then also you're talking about prosecutorial discretion.
Right.
Prosecutorial discretion is very important. And one of the things that I did in the Marine Corps, and I didn't talk about earlier, was I was the head prosecutor for the Marine Corps' Western Recruiting Region. So for the years that I was doing that, anytime a Marine Corps drill instructor or a recruiter west of the Mississippi got into trouble, that case came across my desk. So I both personally prosecuted cases, and I also supervised other prosecutors. And it is important to have discretion to realize, okay, when do we need to actually spend the taxpayer dollars to go after somebody? And that's something that the American people trusted me to do in the past, and I hope the people of Illinois trust me to do in the future. Regarding where my loyalty will be, I think the Attorney General's loyalty needs to be to the federal Constitution and the state Constitution. And if I make no mistake, I will defend the laws of Illinois, but they have to have a colorable argument that they do comply with the Constitution. And one of the issues that came up and has come up during this campaign was the pensions fix in Illinois. And I've gone on the record and said that I would not have defended the pensions legislation because I do not see how it is even close to complying with the pensions clause of the Illinois Constitution. And I think that view, that opinion was actually validated by the Attorney General's office legal briefs that they submitted to the various circuit courts, because their argument, they didn't even try to argue that this pensions fix complied with the Illinois Constitution. Instead, their legal argument was, well, in times of an emergency, a state under its police power can ignore constitutional provisions. And that argument I strongly and vehemently disagreed with. I actually feel like that the fact that Attorney General Madigan made that argument really ought to be disqualifying for her as Attorney General, because it's completely backwards. It's our constitutional provisions that protect us from legislators that are citing emergencies as the basis for dubious legislation. You don't get to just say, oh, well, constitutions don't apply if it's an emergency.
Would you see your role independent of them to say, I don't support this, therefore I'm not going to defend it? Or do you see yourself as Attorney General to say, I am the state's attorney, therefore it is my obligation to defend this, even if I don't support it personally?
Well, I will defend legislation that I personally disagree with or do not support if it complies with the Illinois Constitution. In that case, I just felt like the pensions legislation did not even come close to complying with the Illinois Constitution. But if it's a matter of something that I personally disagree with, I'm going to defend the law. That's what I've done in the past as a lawyer in the Marine Corps. I would give advice on items where I personally disagreed with something, but I would advise based on what the actual law is.
Before we leave, I'll just give it to you to make your last pitch as far as why the people should select you as the next Attorney General.
Well, certainly. Well, right now the status quo is just not working. Our political class really has failed our state. Our state's at a tipping point. We all know people that either want to leave Illinois or are ready to leave at the first opportunity. I think there was a poll that said only 28% of us actually trust our state government. So right now, our politics is just too important to leave to the career politicians and the insiders. We can't keep doing what we're doing. We can't continue with the status quo and more of the same. We need a change. We need somebody from the outside. We need leadership, not political lineage. We need competence, not connections. We need message, not money. When it comes to the Attorney General's office, we need a prosecutor, not a career politician, and we need a Marine, not a Madigan.
All right, Paul Schmipf, we appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks a lot, Terry.
Thank you. You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.